Have you ever looked back at your life and wondered, why did that happen? Why did they leave? Why did that door close? Why did everything fall apart right when it felt like it was finally coming together? We've all had moments like that. Moments where it felt like the universe had forgotten us. Where our prayers were met with silence. Where the path disappeared beneath our feet. But what if none of it was random? What if the heartbreak, the missed chances, the strange timing, the quiet pauses were all part of something deeper? Something you couldn't see at the time, but that was always guiding you, always weaving something sacred behind the scenes. In Buddhist teachings, there's a story about a cracked bowl, a missed boat, and a red thread you never saw. These aren't just stories. They're mirrors. They reveal a truth most of us forget. Nothing in your life is wasted, not even the pain. And in part 4, I'll share the moment that made me cry the first time I heard it. A teaching that completely changed how I look at regret. So take a breath with me. Let's walk this path together. And if these stories touch something in you, know that you're not alone. You are part of an invisible plan. Part 1, the day everything fell apart. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that carries no grand warnings, no ominous signs in the sky, just ordinary silence. The birds were chirping outside his window. The sun had spilled itself across the bedroom floor like golden syrup. And yet, something in the air felt off, like a page had been turned in the great book of his life, but he hadn't caught it. James, 39, marketing manager, just got promoted, recently engaged, caffeine-dependent optimist. Or so he thought. That morning, he made coffee like always, kissed his fiancée on the forehead, and headed out the door with his usual clunky laptop bag slung over his shoulder. He didn't know that by nightfall, the life he had built would collapse like a sandcastle swallowed by a rising tide. First came the phone call. It was from the HR director. Cool voice, measured tone. Words like restructure, budget cuts, and regretfully. A hollow apology wrapped in corporate polish. 37 minutes later, James was holding a cardboard box with his things. A little cactus, 2 framed photos, and the pen his father had given him after college, still with his initials engraved in fading silver. The elevator ride down felt endless. He got home early, too early, and that's when he saw her suitcase by the door. Her coat was gone, her shoes missing. A letter rested on the kitchen counter. 4 lines, no signature. I'm sorry, I don't know who I am anymore. I need space. Please don't follow me. James stood still, for what felt like 1,000 years. He didn't scream, didn't cry. He simply sat down, placed the cardboard box beside the untouched coffee mug, and whispered, "Why? Why now? Why me? Why does everything keep falling apart the moment I thought it was finally coming together?" That night, James didn't sleep. He stared at the ceiling, the streetlights flickering through the blinds like blinking stars. His mind spun in every direction. He asked himself a question that most of us ask at some point. Quietly, desperately, painfully, what did I do to deserve this? But here's the truth, whispered not from logic, but from the soft breath of wisdom that flows through Buddhist teachings. Sometimes life has to fall apart so that something deeper can fall into place. James had spent years building a tower made of plans, goals, promotions, milestones. But he never questioned the foundation. He thought if he followed the script, study hard, get the job, find the girl, build the home, then life would reward him with peace. But peace isn't the reward of control. It's the gift of understanding. And the universe, it doesn't always play by our timelines. It doesn't bow to our calendars or bullet points. In Buddhist thought, everything that happens is conditioned, arising from countless causes and conditions that ripple across lifetimes. Not punishment, not luck, not chaos, but a web of karma unfolding with eerie precision. Yet to the human heart in pain, that teaching can feel cold. So let's soften it. Let's tell it like a story, like a warm fire shared between friends at the edge of sorrow. 2 days after everything crumbled, James wandered into a bookstore. He wasn't looking for anything, maybe just a place to sit where no one expected him to be okay. He passed the fiction shelves, ignored the business section, and somehow ended up in the back, where the lighting dimmed and the titles felt older, dustier, almost forgotten. And there, on a narrow wooden shelf, sat a tiny blue book with gold letters. When loss is a lantern. He picked it up. The pages were thin, textured, and on the very first page, this line stared back at him. Do not be afraid of the breaking. That's where the light comes in. Felt like the book had been waiting for him, like some invisible hand had placed it there, knowing James would show up lost, cracked open and ready. In Buddhism, there's a powerful idea that speaks to this moment. It's called pradityasamutpata, interdependent origination. It teaches us that nothing arises independently. No joy, no pain, no moment in your life is isolated. Everything is part of a vast, intricate web of causes. And within that web, even the darkest moment has a thread that leads somewhere, if we learn how to look. But most of us don't. Not at first. When things fall apart, we want to fix, patch, escape, or at least understand. We demand meaning. We want the universe to send us a scroll that says, here's why you lost your job. Here's why your partner left. Here's why it all had to burn down. But the Dharma doesn't always offer explanations. It offers awareness, a quiet invitation to sit with the fire instead of running from it. That night, James sat in silence. The kind of silence that's not empty, but echoing. He remembered something his grandfather once told him, long ago. When you lose everything, that's when you find what's true. At the time, he'd laughed. But now, that sentence became a thread he couldn't stop pulling. What if this wasn't the end? What if this breakdown was a beginning? What if, just maybe, everything was unfolding for him, not to him? That idea stayed with him, not as a belief, but as a question. One he didn't need to answer, just live into. Somewhere in a remote forest monastery in Thailand, there is a monk who once said, "People come to me with broken hearts. They think they've lost everything. But I tell them, they've only lost what was never meant to stay." The Dharma doesn't take from you. Clears space for what is real. James didn't know this teaching yet, but life was beginning to guide him toward it. 3 weeks after the collapse, he signed up for a silent meditation retreat. Not because he believed in anything, but because he had nothing else left. And sometimes that's when the real journey begins. Let's pause here and speak gently to the listener. Maybe to you. Have you ever had a moment where life unraveled beneath your feet? Where the job ended, the relationship disappeared, the dream collapsed, and all you could do was stare at the pieces. So this story is for you. Not to give you answers, but to remind you there is an invisible plan. Not one drawn by fate, but by the deep wisdom of karma, unfolding moment by moment in service of your awakening. It may not feel like that right now. It may feel like chaos, but just as seeds need darkness to germinate, just as the lotus grows through mud, your soul may be undergoing a transformation that the mind cannot yet comprehend. Hold on, breathe, trust, not blindly but gently, like placing your hand on your own chest and saying, I don't know what this all means yet, but I'm willing to find out. And in that willingness, you take your first step, not toward fixing the past, but toward seeing the invisible plan. Part 2, the story of the cracked bowl. Somewhere, in a quiet village nestled at the edge of a forest where the fog rolls in like a river every morning, lived a young boy named Anul. He was no one special, not in the way the world measures greatness. No gold-embroidered robes, no lineage of scholars or kings. Just a boy with dirt under his fingernails, dreams too large for his tiny hut, and a bowl. But not just any bowl. It was his only possession of worth. A clay bowl, sun-baked, hand-painted by his mother before she passed. Its rim had little carvings of swirling clouds, and at the bottom, barely visible, a faded lotus. Anul used it for everything. Rice, water, sometimes even to catch raindrops when the summer heat dried the well. To him, the bowl wasn't just an object. It was safety. It was history. It was his connection to something tender and gone. And then one day it slipped. Not in some dramatic, slow-motion fashion, but in the most human of ways. He was rushing. late for morning alms. He tripped over a root. The bowl flew, spun, and hit the ground with a sharp, irreversible sound. Crack, the kind of sound that silences everything else. The birds, the breath, the thoughts. Anul stood there, stunned. The bowl was split clean down the side, one piece still clinging by a thread of clay. His eyes filled, not because of the object itself, but because of what it meant. In that moment, the past was broken, the future unclear, and the present unbearable. He gathered the shards, wrapped them gently in a cloth, and carried them to the old monastery at the edge of the forest. There lived a monk named Mahinda, whose face looked like it had been carved by time. Deep lines, soft eyes, and a smile that never tried to fix pain, only hold it. Anul placed the broken bowl in front of him, unable to speak. But he didn't need to. The monk looked at the pieces, then at the boy, and said only this: "Sometimes, the crack is where the sky comes in." Anul didn't understand. Not then. He thought the monk was just trying to make him feel better. But Mahinda didn't reach for glue. He didn't try to mend it. Instead, he picked up the largest piece, turned it over, and tapped the inside wall with his knuckle. A hollow, singing sound filled the space. "Do you hear that?" the monk asked. Anul nodded. "Now listen again." He tapped the cracked side. This time, the sound was deeper, almost haunting, like the forest singing through a wound. "This bowl," Mahinda said, "was made to carry rice. But now, it carries a story. In Buddhist teaching, everything we touch and everything we lose is part of a larger unfolding. Not random, not cruel, not without meaning. The bowl wasn't just an object. It was a symbol of identity, of safety, and sometimes life breaks the symbols we cling to, not to punish us, but to invite us somewhere deeper. We think we came to carry rice, but maybe we came to carry something more. That's what the story of Anul reveals. In the days that followed, the boy was devastated. He stopped going to the monastery. He stopped smiling. But then, almost a week later, something strange happened. Rain fell. A hard, sudden monsoon rolled through the village, flooding paths and rice paddies. And Anul, with no bowl, had nothing to catch water. He panicked. He searched for jars, buckets, anything. But then he remembered the cracked bowl. He ran to where he'd left it under the temple eaves. The cloth had worn thin, but the pieces were still there. He picked up the largest shard and noticed how the crack, now smoothed by time and handling, created a perfect groove. A spout. He tilted it, and for the first time saw not a wound but a design. He set the pieces outside in the rain. Water streamed through the bowl's crack into another container. It became a funnel, a blessing disguised as damage. The next day, Mahinda came and sat beside him, watching silently as the boy gathered water. Anul looked up shyly. "Maybe it's still useful," he said. Mahinda smiled. "Everything is useful," he said. "In the Dharma, even our brokenness is sacred. We live in a world obsessed with perfection. We're told to fix, to restore, to hide the cracks. But in Buddhist philosophy, especially in the teachings of impermanence, anicca, it's the imperfection, the breaking, that opens us to liberation. There's a Japanese art called kintsugi where broken pottery is mended with gold. Not to hide the crack, but to highlight it. To say, this too is beautiful. This too is part of the journey. And in a similar way, our spiritual path is shaped by the parts of us we wish we could erase. That heartbreak, it opened your capacity for compassion. That illness taught you to slow down and listen to your body. That failure, it brought humility and maybe brought you here. Nothing is wasted in the Dharma. Even the cracks become doors. Let's come back to James, the man we met in part 1. A few weeks after the bookstore visit, he was walking in the park when he noticed a child playing with a cracked plastic bucket, scooping water from a pond, letting it drip slowly through a hole in the bottom. The boy laughed every time the water leaked. James smiled, watching, then paused. That image, something broken still being used for joy, it hit him like a bell in a quiet hall. He sat down on a bench and cried. But not from sadness this time. from recognition. Maybe I don't need to be whole to be worthy. Maybe I don't need answers to begin again. Here's what the Buddha taught over and over. The path is not about avoiding suffering. It's about understanding it, holding it, walking with it, and through that understanding, the suffering loses its sharpness. It becomes something else. It becomes the teaching. So, dear listener, if you've ever felt like the bowl of your life is cracked, if you've held broken dreams, shattered plans, or a heart in pieces, know this: there's a monk somewhere in the forest of your soul, sitting beside the brokenness, whispering, "The crack is where the sky comes in. Don't rush to glue it back. Don't hide it. Instead, listen, tap it gently. Hear the new sound it makes. Let it carry a story. Let it become your practice. Let it become your prayer." In the next part of this journey, we'll explore what it really means when people say, karma. Is it fate, punishment, cosmic justice? Or is it something far more compassionate? Something precise, sacred, and invisibly just? Join me in Part 3, Karma is Not Punishment, It's Precision, where we untangle one of the most misunderstood truths in Buddhism and discover the grace behind what seems like life's cruelty. Ready when you are. Part 3, Karma is Not Punishment, It's Precision. When people hear the word karma, most of them flinch. They imagine some invisible judge in the sky, doling out rewards and punishments with cold, cosmic indifference. You did something bad, so now this happens. You were good, so this is your reward. But that's not what the Buddha meant. Not even close. In truth, karma is not a hammer. It's a thread, a quiet, infinitely detailed weaving of cause and effect that stretches across lifetimes. Sometimes seen, sometimes hidden, but always unfolding with gentle precision. Karma isn't the universe out to get you. It's the mirror the universe holds up, so you can see yourself more clearly. Let's go back in time, long before the teachings were written down, back to the Buddha's time in Jetavana Monastery. One afternoon, a distraught farmer came to the monastery gates, his robes soaked in sweat and sorrow. He fell to the ground before the Sangha and cried out, "Why does this keep happening to me? My harvest fails, my son is sick, my wife grows distant, and every year I offer prayers, I make offerings, and still I suffer." The disciples were quiet, but the Buddha, seated beneath the Bodhi tree, simply opened his eyes and said, "You are planting mango seeds, yet expecting lotus flowers." The man blinked. "But I did nothing wrong." The Buddha replied gently, "You do not need to be wrong to suffer. You only need to be unaware. Karma is not about guilt. It's about continuity. Think of your life not as a single candle, but as a flame passed from wick to wick. Each action of body, speech, and mind leaves an imprint, a scent in the room, a ripple in the water. You may not see the stone fall, but you will feel the waves touch the shore. This is why, in Buddhism, karma isn't linear. It's precise, yes, but it's not predictable the way we want it to be. It's not tit for tat. You may plant a seed in this life and the tree may not bloom until another. To the untrained eye, this seems unfair, but to the awakened mind, it's the ultimate compassion. Because karma isn't here to punish you, it's here to teach you, to bring you back again and again into awareness. James, remember him? After weeks of silence and self-reflection, he found himself drawn to an old Zen center tucked between two apartment buildings downtown. It wasn't glamorous. No golden statues or incense clouds. Just wooden floors, a bell, and stillness. He started attending beginner sits, just once a week at first, then twice. One evening, after a particularly long session where his legs had fallen asleep and his mind had wandered to everything from his ex to his tax return, a teacher approached him. An elderly woman in simple gray robes, eyes like water over stone. "You're carrying something," she said gently. James nodded. I don't understand why everything went wrong. I was doing the right things." The teacher smiled. "The rain doesn't fall to hurt the seed. It falls to wake it up." That line stayed with him. He wrote it in a notebook, whispered it during meditation. He began to see his suffering not as random, but as a kind of invitation, an unraveling of the life he thought he needed, so he could meet the life that was waiting underneath. Just like the farmer planting mangoes but yearning for lotuses, James began to realize he had been living from habit, not intention, from expectations, not clarity, from clinging, not truth. And so life responded not to punish but to realign him. Because in Buddhism, karma is more like gravity than judgment. You don't get angry at gravity when you fall. You learn to move with it. Let's take a moment to reflect on a story within a story. There once was a man who stumbled upon a lotus pond during a drought. Cracked earth surrounded the water. Everything else had dried up. Yet in the very center bloomed a single, perfect lotus, untouched, radiant. Curious, he searched around the pond and found an old scroll tied with red thread. Inside were 3 lines: "Where the suffering is greatest, there the teaching is deepest, and where the pain blooms, look for the truth beneath it." That story, though lost in most sutras, speaks to the very heart of karma. Pain is not the enemy, it's the doorway, but you must learn how to knock. James started doing something unusual. Every time a painful thought arose, a memory, a regret, a sharp pang of "why me?" he didn't push it away. Instead, he whispered, "This too has a cause. May I see it?" Sometimes he got nothing but silence. Other times, something remarkable happened. He remembered the day he'd lashed out at his younger brother. Jealousy, bitterness, things said that he'd buried under achievement and busyness. He remembered the way he used to ignore his own exhaustion in pursuit of recognition, thinking if he worked harder, loved harder, succeeded faster, maybe he'd finally feel enough. And he saw it, how those seeds, subtle, unacknowledged, had taken root, not as punishment, but as patterns. The suffering he experienced wasn't random. It was revealing something. There's a saying in Buddhist psychology, when the fruit ripens, the tree bends, which means when karma matures, it shows itself, not to shame you, but to humble you, to bend your mind toward softness. Surrender, insight, is like fire burning away dead wood, pain illuminating the places you're still holding on too tightly. And it's this kind of clarity that begins to free us. Because once you see that karma is not a sentence, but a teacher, you stop asking, "Why me?" and start asking, "What is this showing me?" Let's be honest, this path isn't easy. It's far more tempting to believe that life is just random, that we're victims of chance, that there's no invisible plan, only chaos dressed in fate's clothing. But deep down, if you're still here listening, some part of you senses the truth. Nothing in your life is wasted. Not the heartbreak, not the silence, not even the mistakes. Every thought you've had, every action, every breath, it's all weaving the next moment. And that means you're not stuck. You're shaping the path even now. One final image before we close this part of the journey. Imagine a great weaver, sitting in silence, pulling golden threads across a dark loom. From a distance, all you see is knots, chaos, tangled colors, mistakes. But step back far enough, and you begin to see a tapestry. Your life is that tapestry. And karma? Karma is the hand guiding the thread, not judging it, but placing it with care. The more aware you become, the more beautifully the pattern unfolds. So if you're holding something heavy, if you've been blaming yourself or cursing the sky, just pause. Place your hand on your heart and say, "This is not a punishment. This is a path." The thread may be invisible, but it is never lost. And neither are you. Part 4: The Master Who Missed the Boat. There's a small island off the southern coast of Sri Lanka, known not for its beaches or its markets, but for a story. A story that doesn't appear in any textbook, yet has been passed down from monk to monk, like a soft breath carrying incense through the trees. They say that over 100 years ago, a great meditation master, Venerable Simanapala, was invited to speak at a royal council across the sea. The king himself had sent the request. The entire Buddhist community was to gather, a once-in-a-lifetime convergence of minds, teachings, and blessings. It would be the master's most important journey. Everything was prepared. His disciples helped pack scrolls, robes, and a humble mat to sit on. They bowed before him with reverence, knowing this was a moment history would remember. And yet, when the day arrived, something strange happened. The boat left without him. It wasn't because he overslept or changed his mind. He had risen before dawn as always, bathed in cold water, chanted the morning suttas with clarity and devotion. But on the path to the dock, he paused. A young child stood by the roadside, crying beside an injured dog. The animal had been struck by a cart and lay whimpering, unable to move. The villagers had walked past, whispering that nothing could be done. But the master, he stopped. He removed his outer robe, gently lifted the dog, and carried it to a shaded place under a tree. He mixed herbs, cleaned the wound, spoke softly to calm the child. And by the time he arrived at the dock, the sails had already vanished beyond the horizon. Gone. The boat, the council, the invitation of a lifetime. The disciples were horrified. "Master," they pleaded, "this was your chance to reach thousands, to bring your voice to the world." But the monk only looked out at the water, eyes still, voice steady. "The world will hear what it's meant to hear when the time is right. But today, that child needed to see someone stop. That dog needed to feel mercy. And I needed to remember, Dharma is not about being known. It is about being true." 3 days later, the boat sank. A storm, sudden and violent, cracked the sky in two. Lightning struck the mast. Waves swallowed the vessel like it was made of paper. No survivors. Not one. We tell this story not to glorify tragedy, but to remind ourselves of something we often forget. What feels like a delay is sometimes divine protection. We mourn the missed job, the canceled trip, the closed door, as if life had failed to follow our instructions. But what if it was following something wiser? What if the very thing you're grieving was never yours because it was never meant for your path? James, the man whose life unraveled in part 1, had his own version of this story. 2 months after his layoff and breakup, he got a call from a former colleague offering him a new role. It was lucrative, high profile, fast-paced, a chance to bounce back. He almost said yes, but something in his gut tightened, a subtle tension he couldn't explain. So he paused. He asked for a day to think. That night, he sat with the question, am I choosing this out of alignment or out of fear? He realized the truth. He wasn't drawn to the job. He was terrified of stillness, afraid that if he didn't rebuild fast enough, he'd be forgotten. So he said no. A week later, the company announced mass restructuring. Layoffs. Scandal. The colleague who had called him? Let go. James sat alone on his porch, watching the rain roll down the railing. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like life was punishing him. He felt protected. In Buddhism, this principle is known through the teaching of upaya, skillful means. Not everything is direct. Not every path is straight. Sometimes the universe teaches not through achievement, but through interruption. And these interruptions are not obstacles. They are invitations to realign. Just like a river winding around rocks, the Dharma doesn't resist what is, it flows with it, even when that means missing the boat. Let me share something personal. There was a time I thought I'd lost my way completely. A project I believed in collapsed. A friendship ended without closure. And my health, something I'd always counted on, began to falter. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment, hands on my knees, whispering, "What now?" No lightning came, no vision, just silence. But in that silence, I heard something else. My breath, still rising, still falling. It was enough, because the Dharma doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes, it arrives like a breath that keeps showing up, even when everything else falls away. So maybe, just maybe, that person who didn't choose you, that door that didn't open, that path that crumbled beneath your feet, it wasn't rejection. It was protection, not from something bad, but for something better, something truer, something that aligns with the invisible plan your soul came here to live. Back to the story of Master Sumanapala. Years later, when the rains had come and gone, when his beard had turned the color of ash, a young monk asked him, "Do you ever regret missing the boat?" The old master smiled, not a wide smile, a soft one, like a whisper on his face. "Every day," he said, "every single day, I thank the ocean for closing that door." He paused. "You see, I thought I was supposed to teach thousands, but instead, I was meant to teach one." He gestured toward a tree. Beneath it sat a young boy, the same child whose dog he had rescued, now grown, now ordained, a monk, a vessel for the Dharma. We never really know who or what we're saving when we choose to stay present. Maybe the dog, maybe the child, maybe ourselves. But life does, and sometimes it steers us not where we want to go, but where we are needed most, even if that means missing the boat. So if you've ever felt behind, if you've ever watched a dream sail away while you stood on the dock wondering what you did wrong, if you've ever whispered, "But I was ready," only to be met with silence, then hear this: you didn't miss your path. You were rerouted towards something holier. And one day, maybe not now, maybe not soon, but one day, you will look back and whisper, "Thank you for the delay," because that pause, that turn, that empty dock, it may have been the moment that saved your life. In part 5, The Thread You Didn't See, we'll follow the invisible red thread that connects every loss, every strange turn, and every unanswered prayer to a story far bigger than the one you thought you were living. This next part might change the way you see every setback you've ever faced. Shall we begin? Part 5, The Thread You Didn't See. Somewhere in the forests of northern Japan, nestled beneath the branches of ancient pine and soft snowfall, there's a quiet legend passed down through centuries. It's not written in any sutra or carved in temple stone, but shared in the hush between monks, often by firelight or in the stillness before morning chanting. It's the tale of the red thread. They say that each soul, upon entering this life, is tied to an invisible red thread, a silken filament spun by karma and carried by intention. It stretches across mountains, rivers, lifetimes. You cannot see it, you cannot cut it, but it's always pulling you, gently, persistently, toward the people, places, and lessons meant only for you. Sometimes it leads you into joy, sometimes into loss, sometimes into complete unraveling. But always it leads you home. James never knew this legend, but he was beginning to feel something shift in the fabric of his life. It was subtle, like a breeze brushing the back of your neck, like a thought that rises before words form. He still didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in months, he no longer felt lost. One morning, while walking a forest trail not far from his apartment, James stopped. A small red string had caught on a branch, fluttering gently in the wind. Thin, faded, fragile looking, but it held. He touched it with one finger. He smiled. No one else was around, but in that moment he felt accompanied, as if some intelligence beneath the surface was leaving him a clue. In Buddhist philosophy, the universe doesn't operate by random chance. Every encounter, every delay, every unraveling is a thread in a greater weave. The issue is we only see the knots, the missed calls, the failed relationships, the job that didn't work out, the friend that walked away, the illness we didn't expect, the almosts and not yets. We hold them like loose strings in our hands, trying to tie them into something that resembles meaning. But what we forget is, there is always another side of the thread, a side we can't see yet. Take Maya, for instance, a woman in her late 50s, grieving the loss of her husband. They'd been married 32 years. No kids, just the two of them. She said goodbye one Tuesday morning, and by nightfall, he was gone. Stroke, sudden, no warning. The grief didn't come all at once. Came in waves, in echoes, in the quiet rustle of a coat he used to wear, in the sound of the kettle boiling for two, now only for one. She stopped leaving the house, stopped laughing, stopped praying, until one day, by accident, or what seemed like accident, she stepped into a small Buddhist temple tucked behind a grocery store. She didn't know why. She just walked in. The monk inside said nothing at first, just poured her tea, let her sit. Then he said, Even a broken heart follows the thread. Even the silence is part of the music. That sentence haunted her. He didn't try to explain anything. He didn't quote scripture or tell her it would be okay. He just acknowledged the thread. Over the next few months, Maya began to see signs. A letter in her husband's old drawer from a friend she'd never met, who later became her closest companion. A community garden starting in their neighborhood, something he had always wanted to create. And one afternoon, while helping arrange flowers at the temple, she overheard a young girl weeping softly. Her father had just passed. Maya sat beside her, held her hand, told her, "I know what it's like." In that moment, the girl exhaled. Something in her shifted, and so did Maya, because suddenly, her pain wasn't just hers. It had become a bridge. The thread had looped back, not to heal the past, but to connect two souls through it. This is the nature of the invisible plan. It doesn't unfold according to our calendars. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't shout its reasons. It whispers in synchronicities and detours and strange, exquisite timing. And the longer you walk this path, the more you begin to sense. There's no such thing as random. In Tibetan Buddhism, there's a concept called tendrel, dependent connection. It's the idea that nothing arises in isolation. Every experience is tied to another. Every meeting is a reunion. Every ending is a beginning in disguise. You didn't just run into that teacher. You weren't just coincidentally in that bookstore the day your heart broke. The person you bumped into in the coffee line, the book that fell off the shelf into your hands, the illness that made you sit down for the first time in years, these aren't interruptions. They're threads. Threads guiding you through the dark. Threads anchoring you to the Dharma even when you don't believe in anything anymore. Back to James. He was walking one evening when he passed a yoga studio with a small sign on the door. Intro to mindful movement, pay what you can. He almost kept walking, but something pulled him back. Inside, the room was warm. Wooden floors, candles flickering, a dozen people moving slowly to the sound of their breath. He joined, and in the back corner, he saw someone familiar. It was the woman he'd sat beside at the Zen Center weeks ago. They nodded, nothing more, but afterward, she handed him a folded piece of paper. No name, just a quote written in soft ink. "You are not lost. You are being rewoven." That night, James dreamed of red threads. They floated above his bed like fireflies, winding through the sky, intertwining, not in straight lines, but in spirals, circles, constellations. He didn't try to follow them. He simply watched, and in the morning he felt lighter. He didn't have the answers, but he had a deep, quiet trust. The kind of trust that doesn't come from knowing where you're going, but from knowing you're being guided. Dear listener, maybe you've felt it too. Maybe you've had moments that made no sense at the time, but later revealed themselves as perfect pivots. Maybe a delay saved you. Maybe a loss softened you. Maybe the very thing you cursed became the reason you grew. And maybe, just maybe, the thread that runs through your life is not random string, but the Dharma weaving a story far more beautiful than the one you thought you were writing. So pause for a moment, close your eyes, breathe, and ask gently, not for a sign, but for the ability to notice the thread when it appears. Maybe in a smile, maybe in a memory, maybe in the way the wind moves the curtains at just the right time. Because the thread is always there. You don't have to find it. You just have to stop pulling in the wrong direction and start listening. In part 6, when the lotus finally blooms, we'll return to the teachings of impermanence and discover why some of our deepest awakenings take time. Why the Dharma ripens only when the heart is ready, not when the mind demands it. You'll learn why nothing is truly late, and why your season of blooming may be just around the corner, even if the mud hasn't yet begun to dry. Shall we continue? Part 6. When the lotus finally blooms. There's an old saying in the Pali scriptures, just as the lotus is born from mud, untouched by the water, so too is the awakened mind born from the world, yet not tainted by it. But what the texts rarely mention is how long the lotus takes to bloom. They don't describe the cold silence beneath the pond's surface, where the seed waits in darkness. They don't speak of the days when nothing stirs, of the weeks when the mud feels endless, of the nights when the seed wonders if light was just a myth. But the lotus always blooms, not because it is forced, not because it is perfect, but because it is ready. James was beginning to understand this, not in theory but in his bones. It had been months since everything fell apart. His relationship, his career, the identity he once wore like a crisp suit every morning. Gone. In its place, a strange spaciousness had opened. Not comfort, not certainty, but space. Space to feel, to question, to rest. And in that stillness, something began to stir. Something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness, but aliveness. He noticed it first in small ways. The sound of a sparrow brushing past his window before sunrise. The sensation of water running across his palms at the sink. The moment the breeze slipped through the trees and touched his neck just right. Like a hand he couldn't see, but somehow remembered. He wasn't seeking anything anymore. And in that not seeking, things began to find him. Books, conversations, dreams, silence. All of it blooming, not because he was doing the right things, but because he had finally stopped trying to control the soil. Buddhist teachers often speak of ripening. They say that insight cannot be rushed, that suffering, like fruit, must ripen on the branch of experience before it can drop into the hand of wisdom. And that sometimes what you think is stagnation is really just the season before spring. Let me tell you a story. It's not written down anywhere, but it's whispered in temple gardens when the night is soft and the tea is warm. There was once a novice monk who planted a lotus seed in a clay bowl outside his hut. He watered it every day, spoke to it gently, offered it sunlight and silence. Weeks passed. Nothing. The novice grew impatient. Maybe the seed is dead, he muttered. He stopped watering it, moved the bowl to the corner behind the laundry line. One day, many weeks later, while hanging his robes to dry, he caught sight of something. A small green shoot, fragile, delicate, alive. He fell to his knees and wept. A senior monk, hearing his cries, came outside. The novice looked up through tears. "I gave up on it," he whispered. The elder smiled. "No, child, you just gave it time." James was beginning to bloom, not in the way people expect. There were no fireworks, no dramatic breakthroughs, no phone call saying, "It all makes sense now." Just breath, just stillness, just moments of clarity rising like mist over a morning lake. He no longer needed to prove himself, no longer needed to chase the illusion of a fixed identity. He was learning to be, and this is the essence of Dharma awakening. Not becoming someone else, but remembering who you were before the noise. So many of us live trapped in timelines. We say, "I should have had this by 30. I should be healed by now. I should already know my purpose." But the Dharma does not rush. The lotus does not open because you yell at it. It opens because the sun rises, the mud softens, the water warms, and the time has come. And when it does, it unfolds in perfect, wordless grace. If you're listening now, maybe you're still in the mud. Maybe your heart feels heavy. Maybe you've been waiting for so long that you're not sure blooming is even possible for you. I want you to know this. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not too late. You are ripening, and that takes time. The lotus grows in water, but its roots cling to mud. And isn't that what our pain is? Mud? Heavy, sticky, real, but not shameful, not wrong, necessary. Without it, the flower would have no foundation. This is why, in Buddhism, suffering isn't avoided. It's transformed. Through awareness, through compassion, through presence. James sat one morning, watching the rain touch the surface of a pond near the temple he now visited every week. The rain didn't ask the pond to be ready. It just fell, and the pond received it, softly, openly. He smiled. He finally understood. Healing doesn't arrive when we fix the past. It arrives when we stop resisting the present. And that too is blooming. So, dear listener, if your life feels paused, if your efforts feel unseen, if your dreams feel buried, Remember, the lotus is growing, even when it's still invisible. And when it blooms, it does not compare itself to the lilies. It does not apologize for taking time. It simply rises and reflects the sun. Take a breath now, right where you are. Hand on heart, whisper gently, I trust the timing of my unfolding. Let it echo, let it land. You are blooming in silence, and that is enough. In part 7, Trust the Invisible Plan, we will bring all the threads together. You'll discover how forgetting, falling, and letting go are not signs of failure, but acts of deep spiritual intelligence. And you'll be invited to finally see your whole story, not as a mess of broken pieces, but as a masterpiece guided by the hands of the unseen. Shall we begin the final part of this journey? Part 7, Trust the Invisible Plan. There's a moment, deep in the stillness of a meditation retreat, where the mind stops searching. No more questions, no more stories, just breath, just presence, just this. And in that silence, something begins to rise, not as a thought, but as a knowing, that maybe the plan was never meant to be seen, only lived, only trusted. James sat under the Bodhi tree outside the retreat center. His journey had not led him to answers. It had led him here, to presence, to peace, to a place within himself he never knew existed. There were still no guarantees, no ribbon-wrapped purpose. His old life had not magically returned. His career had not reappeared in glittering form. His relationship had not been restored. But his heart, it had softened, and that softening was everything. He remembered something a monk had said during a walking meditation. The Dharma doesn't promise clarity. It offers freedom from needing it. Those words echoed as James watched a leaf drift from the tree above him, spinning slowly, like a prayer falling from the sky. No resistance, no fear, just surrender. And he thought, maybe the invisible plan isn't something to be discovered. Maybe it's something to be trusted, felt, honored. In Buddhism, there's a story told in soft voices, usually after evening chants, when the light dims and the mind begins to release its grip. It's called The Path of the Forgotten Map. A young seeker wanders for years searching for the way to enlightenment. He studies maps, visits sages, memorizes teachings, collects every scroll he can find. But every path leads to more questions, more detours, more doubt. One day, exhausted, he throws his satchel into the river. The maps float away. He collapses beside the water, ashamed, empty-handed, defeated. An old monk appears and sits beside him. "Why did you let go?" he asks. "I had nothing left," the seeker whispers. The monk smiles. "Then now you can begin." This is what it means to trust the invisible plan. It's not about having the perfect map. It's about walking with open eyes and a steady heart, knowing that even when you can't see the road can see you. And it will rise to meet your feet, step by step, breath by breath. James didn't need to go back. He didn't need to rebuild, because he had discovered something that doesn't need repair. The truth of being, not doing, not fixing, not becoming, just being. And from that place, the next step always appears. If you're listening to this, maybe you're still waiting, still wondering when things will make sense, still hoping for closure or clarity or a moment of light breaking through the fog. But let me ask you gently, what if this is the light? Not the answers, but this moment, this pause, this breath, this quiet presence is the beginning of your unfolding. The invisible plan isn't something you wait for. It's something you begin to see the moment you stop demanding that life explain itself. There's a passage from the Dhammapada that often goes unnoticed. Like a bee gathering nectar from flowers, without harming the color or fragrance, so too, the wise one moves through the world, quiet, unseen, yet changing everything. This is how the plan unfolds. Quietly, softly, unseen, but utterly life-changing when we begin to listen. James eventually did return to work, but not the same work. He began teaching mindfulness to people in transition, men and women who had lost jobs, relationships, identities. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't need them. He offered something more powerful: presence. He showed them what it looked like to trust the invisible, to stand still even when you couldn't see the shore, to say, "I don't know what's next, but I know I'm here." And that was enough, because at the heart of Buddhist wisdom is this: freedom isn't found in knowing. It's found in letting go of needing to know. You don't need to understand why the boat left. You don't need to explain why the bowl cracked. You don't need to fix the thread. You only need to breathe and trust that this too belongs. Let me speak to you now directly, softly. Maybe you've been carrying the weight of a detour you didn't choose. Maybe life has felt like a riddle with no solution. Maybe you've blamed yourself or fate or karma. But here's the deeper truth. You haven't failed. You're not behind. You are right on time. Every silence, every goodbye, every lost dream, they were not mistakes. They were movements of the Dharma. They were the ground preparing for your blooming. Take a moment now. Close your eyes. Let the breath move in and out like waves that don't ask questions. Let your heart whisper, "I don't need to see the whole path. I only need to take this next step." And in that next step, the plan continues. So what is the invisible plan? It's not a strategy. It's not a blueprint. It's a presence, a compassionate unfolding that leads you, not where you expected to go, but where your soul is meant to awaken, not to win, not to fix, but to remember who you truly are. And when you finally meet yourself there, barefoot, breath full, eyes open, you'll understand everything happened just as it needed to, not in spite of the pain, but through it, not after the loss, but because of it. So trust the red thread, thank the missed boat, hold the cracked bowl, sit in the mud, because the lotus is on its way. And when it blooms, you won't need to understand the plan. You'll just know you were always part of it. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, gently subscribe and share the space with someone who's still finding their thread. Together, may we remember, everything happens for a reason, even if the reason is simply to awaken. Somewhere right now, a lotus is blooming, not in a perfect pond, but in the thickest mud. Not because it knew how, but because it trusted the unfolding. And maybe you are that lotus. Maybe your delays were not detours. Maybe your losses were not punishments. Maybe this whole time, you were not lost, just being rerouted. So ask yourself gently tonight, before sleep finds you, what if the plan was always working, even when I couldn't see it? What if this breath right here was the beginning of something sacred? You don't need to understand it all. You don't need to fix the past. You only need to breathe and keep going. And if this story softened something in you, if it reminded you that you're not alone on the path, then let's keep walking together. Subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings and share this space with someone who may need a little light today. Because sometimes a single story can become a thread in someone else's healing. And you never know, you might just be the invisible plan in someone else's life.